Yes, we're live actually. So, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, welcome you all again. And I take this privilege to warmly welcome you again to the 104th online lecture of CC19 lecture series on this platform. As you know, Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social science. It carries the legacy of the academic study of Indian languages and literature, mostly envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department was established, which was established by the Professor Vishwanath Roy, and which continues to carry on the research in Indian languages and on the various disciplines mostly. And from this history, actually, we took inspiration, and it is mostly initiated by the research scholars of the Department of Comparative Indian Language and Literature. And we are mostly organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Also, along with it, we are currently arranging online workshops and language learning, mostly in Indian language section, and some of the workshop in translation also, and publishing a national biography series in our website calcom.org. Uh, a big thank you to our mentor, Dr. Minmay Pramanik and Obhinav Moitro for their ideas and everything. So I didn't take much time today as we are like already a bit late to start. And now I would hand over this virtual platform to Aratrika Ganguly, our founding member, and she will going to introduce Professor Sara Besky for today's session. So over to you, Aratrika. Please introduce Professor.
Thank you, Pratim, and welcome all of you, and a warm welcome to Professor Sara Beske to the 100th lecture of the CC19 lecture series. Professor Sara Beske is a cultural anthropologist and an associate professor in the ILR School. Professor Beske has been awarded a senior research fellowship by the American Institute of Indian Studies to carry out a project, Land, Labor and the Work of Settlement in Kalimpong, West Bengal in India. Her research uses ethnographic and historical methods to study the intersection of inequality, nature, and capitalism in the Himalayas. In her work, she analyzes how materials and bodies take on value under changing political economic regimes, and she explores the diverse forms of labor that make and maintain their value. Articles on these questions have appeared in Cultural Anthropology, American Ethnologist, American Anthropologist, Comparative Studies in Society and History, and many more other journals. Her first book, The Darjeeling Distinction, Labor and Justice on Fair Trade Tea Plantations in India, a quite popular book and a very well-known book in this field, was published by the University of California Press in 2014. It explores how legacies of colonialism intersect with contemporary market reforms to configure notions of the value of labor, of place, and of tea itself. Professor Beske's second book, Testing Polities, The Past and Future of Tea, was published in 2020 by the University of California Press. This book blends historical and ethnographic research on science value and the idea of quality in the tea industry to analyze efforts at economic reform in India. Another book, How Nature Works, Rethinking Labor on a Troubled Planet, was published by the Sara Press in 2019. Professor Beske, co-edited with Alex Blanchett, brings together contemporary theoretical conversations is post-humanism with classic and continually relevant questions about political economy, precarity, and the meanings of work. Professor Beske's new research explores the intersections of agricultural extension and experimentation, colonial and post-colonial governance, and the everyday productive and reproductive work of farming in the Himalayan region, especially of Kalimpong. Thank you, Professor Beske, for joining us today. She will be talking on the plantations outside, agricultural experimentation, and the work of settlement in Kalimpong. And she has been like my inspiration as well. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today. You may please begin your virtual lecture.
Well, thank you so much, Artrika and Pratim for the invitation to come and talk with you all. Just so you know, I'm a really informal person, so I don't know. Pratim, is my screen share is it visible to folks? My email address is there. Like, shoot me an email. Hopefully, right? Knock on wood. Omicron and all other variants permitting, I will hopefully see you all in India, right, sometime starting in May, to restart this project that I'm talking about. So what I'm talking about today is very much new and ongoing research. So I really look forward to kind of thinking with everyone here about it more. So with that, I'm going to kind of make my screen a little bit bigger, and that means I can't see any of you. So forgive me as I kind of move into kind of another Zoom dimension. Okay, so most of my research has been, as noted, on tea production, particularly in the plantations of India's Eastern Himalaya. This region is often associated with tea and plantations, right? Like kind of firmly and hegemonically. But today I'm going to talk about my new and ongoing research on the plantation's outsides. I came to this project having spent a lot of time thinking about life on plantations. I've written about how tea workers live their lives and care for their families in spaces outside of the tea fields in which they work. The construction of an outside to the plantation is, of course, not unique to India. In her work on Caribbean plantations, Jamaican cultural theorist Sylvia Wynter juxtaposes the plot and the plantation. From the inception of the Caribbean plantation, planters ceded land to enslaved people on which they could grow food to feed themselves. These so-called provision grounds, Wynter notes, also maximized the profits of the plantation by keeping people alive. They were sites for the reproduction of African foodways, oral tradition, and even anti-colonial resistance. Relationships of production and reproduction got me to thinking about the crops that are grown and circulate in plantation economies, but that aren't necessarily tea or rubber or cinchona, right? Crops that don't count in narratives of agriculture in colonial or post-colonial governance. In the Himalayan foothills, these are things like cardamom and celery, flowers, mulberry, and maize. So I adopt here in the larger project a feminist political economic and feminist science and technology, STS, approach to agrarian life and labor that centers these crops, these non-plantation crops, to tell a story about the region. And today I'm going to share a slice of this story by highlighting some historical and ethnographic work on settlement and agricultural extension. So break. Okay. So Henry Raymond Edmonds, you see here with his pit helmet, was born in 1888, most likely on a tea plantation in the Doors region of what is now West Bengal. The son of a white father and an Indian mother, he would have been labeled by the colonial establishment as quote-unquote half-caste or a Eurasian child. His documented life begins in an orphanage run by the American Protestant missionary in the Bengal Administrative Center of Asansol in the early 1900s. Despite these humble beginnings, by 1922, he'd become the superintendent of agriculture for the Darjeeling district, and in 1935, he was given an MBE for his services to imperial agronomy. Today, Edmonds is nearly forgotten, both in India and in Britain. What remains of his biography is available only in fragments. Yet his story, that of an orphaned Anglo-Indian child who became a senior civil servant and scientist in the British colonial bureaucracy, is instructive for understanding the logics and practices of colonial land management and agriculture on India's geographical margins. Though Edmonds' life coincided with the economic apex of plantation-based production in India, he himself was never a tea planter. He spent his career on the outsides of the plantations in the missionary and agricultural enclave of Kalimpong, just across the Teesta River from the famed plantations of Darjeeling, right? And this is part of a talk that I don't normally give to area studies audiences, so this is a very, for this audience, a very familiar image, but it's in the presentation, right? So I'm working in Kalimpong, right? Kind of in the center of the screen. The heroes of most colonial accounts of this region, right, the greater Darjeeling region, tend to be white tea planters. The history of Kalimpong and the work of Henry Edmonds, however, highlight that in order to understand how colonial governance worked in the Indian Himalaya, it is necessary to look beyond the plantation. To this day, residents of Kalimpong maintain that they occupy a green belt, an explicit and deliberate contrast, an outside, to the region's most notable crop production system. Central to colonial governance on the margins of British India was the notion of settlement, right? And this is an operative concept that I'm working with here. Settlement is perhaps the quintessential colonial aspiration and technique, but it has taken different forms, from the proactive invasion of stolen land by white populations, to the transformation of rangeland into pasture, to the educational or penal effort to civilize and discipline indigenous peoples. Colonial settlement in India, and in Kalimpong in particular, the way I'm talking about it, was distinct from settler colonialism in North America or Australia, where indigenous groups were displaced, like fully displaced onto different lands by white settlers. In Kalimpong, settlement was less a geographical diffusion of white bodies onto land, and more of a diffusion of European legal, economic, and ethical postures towards land, and with it, the diffusion of senses of work, self, and belonging. Agricultural extension and agricultural demonstration, in particular, was a key technology of that diffusion. So I first learned of Henry Edmonds in a series of annual reports he wrote as the manager of a 70-acre Kalimpong demonstration farm. When the demonstration farm opened in 1907, it sloped down from the bazaar of Kalimpong to the banks of the Reli River, thousands of feet below. This made the farm representative of varied soil types, slopes, and altitudes in which Kalimpong's farmers worked. Today, the site still houses a governmental agricultural experimental station. The station is supported by the Extension and Training Branch of the Ministry of Agriculture and Farming. It is known to Kalimpong residents today, though, as the seed farm, and which kind of harkens back to a time in which farmers could obtain free and subsidized seed there. In Kalimpong, the creation of a viable, smallholder-driven food economy was vital to the expansion of colonial governance and to the reproduction of the plantation economy. Settlement was a biopolitical process. It required a close management of sex, kinship, nutrition, and disease. In Kalimpong, colonial and missionary actors worked to deliberately construct an explicit non-plantation landscape that was oriented to what Michelle Murphy calls distributed reproduction, or the distributed reproduction of life, both human and non-human. So distributed reproduction as a concept opens what counts as reproduction and reproductive labor. It opens it up. It brings attention to reproduction beyond bodies, within uneven and fractured spatial and temporal infrastructures. With such infrastructures, Murphy argues, some aspects of life are supported while others are abandoned. Infrastructures promote some forms of life and avert others. Such a perspective allows us to think about reproduction and really settlement more broadly as a land and labor logic in terms of accretion, latency, intergenerational time, and thwarted life. So I'm going to kind of organize my talk in three movements. First, I'm going to talk about colonial settlement and market formation. I'm then going to to show how this imperative was situated in other reproductive logics. And then I'm going to return to Edmonds' work to discuss agricultural experimentation and demonstration in Kalimpong. Okay, so part one. So some background on Kalimpong, right? And this may be familiar to some of you. Kalimpong was part of a swath of land annexed by the British from the King of Bhutan in 1865. And here you can kind of see kind of a territory, Bhutanese territory from 1775, a little old map. This area, referred to in colonial texts as the Bhutan Durs, included large parts of the contemporary states of West Bengal and Assam. The British annexed the Durs with the intent of widening and fortifying the colony's northern border and widening a territorial land bridge to the resource frontier, the extractive frontier of Northeast India. The annexation also brought the British geographically closer to potential kind of trade, or really potential or trade with three independent kingdoms, right? Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim. Tea plantations, established in Darjeeling in the 1850s and a couple of decades earlier in adjacent Assam, came to blanket this newly annexed land. Plantation expansion gave rise, however, to two biopolitical challenges. First, the racial division of labor on plantations was clear, with white managers geographically and socially segregated from Adivasi or Nepali field laborers. The presence of mixed-race children like Henry Edmonds therefore presented a problem for the plantation complex built on the assumption that certain racialized bodies were naturally suited for certain spaces and forms of work. Second, while planters provided workers with garden space to grow food, these gardens were not sufficient to sustain the steadily growing population with basic staples like rice, millet, and corn. Tea planters had initially offered garden space as a labor recruitment tool, particularly in Darjeeling. But over time, they severely restricted this space by planting, more tea or putting worker housing on top of that garden space. Darjeeling town, high atop the ridge and surrounded by plantations, was the summer capital of British India. Right? This meant that an entire administrative infrastructure moved up to the cooler hills to escape the hot, rainy summer months in Calcutta. The problem of how to feed both plantations and the seasonal administrative class who descended on this hill station was only magnified in the wake of the annexation of Bhutan and the expansion of British India's northeastern frontier. So in 1882, almost 20 years after the annexation of Bhutan, British civil servants established the government estate of Kalimpong and as a settled agricultural outside to the plantation. An enclave for food production, right? So an enclave for stuff you could eat, not stuff that was commodity crops. As the name government estate implies, the colonial government would be the sole landlord. What colonial bureaucrats termed survey and settlement operations began with cadastral surveying, the twinned process of first mapping land and then rent setting for plots of land that were just mapped. Swidden and forests were divided into individual holdings to be made productive. The government of Bengal supported local land agents, mandals, in providing recruitment incentives to peasants, right, ryots, from either low caste or tribal groups from Nepal, or who these mandals even recruited off of Darjeeling plantations to resettle in Kalimpong. And they also, kind of resettled indigenous Lepcha and Bhutia groups, and kind of put all of these different, farmers into individualized plots on the government estate, and kind of remade indigenous and migrant Nepali folks as permanently settled, rent-paying farmers on the estate. Between the annexation of Bhutan and the first settlement of Kalimpong again in 1882, right, there was a whole period, right, in the 1870s, right, that saw famines sweep across India, including Bengal and Bihar. Famines, of course, are not in any way a natural phenomenon. And these famines in particular have been called a genocide, and for good reason. But in response, the colonial government, right, set up the first of a series of these famine commissions. These famine commissions called for many things, right, including the establishment of a new Bengal agricultural department. So there's not really a Bengal agricultural department until after the series of famines in Bengal and Bihar. And that agricultural department was formalized in 1886. In that year, the newly appointed director of the agricultural department explained there was a technocratic solution to famine, and his new department would be focused on, quote unquote, better methods for cultivation, the diffusion of agricultural knowledge through training in agricultural colleges, and the collection of statistics of vital agricultural and economic facts. Agricultural statistics, he stressed, were an essential requisite of good government. On government estates like Kalimpong, the post-famine bureaucratic project of making live was linked to an economic project of making work, making productive. The department's purpose was to ostensibly prevent famine, but it was also more explicitly aimed at making non-plantation land profitable through rents and revenue. It was about kind of making indigenous groups legible to colonial governance, and it was about figuring out ways for people to feed themselves and pay their rents. A close measurement of the food supply was intertwined with an active investment in farmer productivity. And this reflected a larger biopolitical logic that was kind of emergent across the British Empire, right? Kalimpong's emblematic of a larger process then. With this establishment of the new agricultural department, the government surveyed 10 million acres of land in Bengal. To do this, the department trained and deployed a force of European settlement officers, along with a large and nearly exclusively Indian staff. Their surveys produced or updated cadastral maps. These maps allowed settlement officers to return to the same plots each year to see whether fallow land had been brought under cultivation, and if so, to extract rent from the ryot whose name appeared on the record. If the land was occupied by a ryot who was not on the official rolls and therefore not paying rent, the collector could take revenue in the form of in-kind payments of harvested crops. If a plot had gone out of cultivation or was kind of fully abandoned, the agent could attempt to resettle that plot with a new ryot. The first survey and settlement of Kalimpong again took place in 1882. During this first settlement, surveyed land was divided into blocks, each to be overseen by a mundal. The plot in each block were populated by individual ryots and their families, either indigenous Lepchas and Bhutyas who had been living in this region right before the occupation, or with Nepali farmers who had been displaced from their homes in eastern Nepal. The mundal collected rent from ryots and remitted it to the estate manager. In return, the mundal was able to keep 10% of their collections. The cadastral surveys divided land into categories of productive or unproductive. The rate of rent for productive land was 8 annas per acre, and for unproductive land, it was 4 annas per acre, with an anna being about 1/16 of a rupee, as you all know. Productivity was defined as the broadest sense of fertility of soil, proximity to markets, and other advantages. Rents were set on 10-year terms. Those rents were raised during subsequent settlements, which were repeated every 10 years from 1882 to 1921. In each block, the settlement officers identified large plots of wasteland on which mundals could settle new residents. In the intervening years between settlement operations, mundals could keep all of the rents that they collected from these new wasteland settlers. And again, all land was owned by the colonial government. So in order to get produce from the estate to the market, the settlement guidelines stated that each ryot, quote, one side behind, excuse me. So the settlement guidelines, the settlement reports, stated that each ryot, in the words of the report, quote, must supply provisions and coolies according to his ability for government purposes at market rates. And in addition, each adult resident in Kalimpong had to supply 2 days of free labor. You can kind of see that here, to build, namely, roads. These lease terms required ryots to erect boundary markers within 6 months of occupation. They had to surrender land if the government wanted it back. They could not cut down trees of more than 1 foot in girth, and they had to plant 1 tree per acre per year. They had no exclusive rights to any use of a stream, focused on road building, forestation, and the establishment of viable food crops. The settlement process distributed reproduction beyond bodies to support and manage life. Ryots were compelled to construct an infrastructure that was intent on designating and managing surplus life for the sake of capital. Here, surplus was both the human labor power beyond the immediate needs of agricultural production, and surplus in terms of agricultural yields beyond the immediate needs of the farmer. Settlement harnessed labor surplus through the construction and maintenance of infrastructure, and it harnessed agricultural surplus through the construction of food markets. This management of surplus in both these terms linked agricultural production and social reproduction. A ryot could not give land to another ryot without consent of the deputy commissioner, and they could not sublet it either. Though Nepalis could and did intermarry with the Lepcha and Bhutia communities, policies restricted Lepchas and Bhutias from transferring their land leases to Nepalis. Other so-called objectionable transfers included cases of individuals who had already acquired multiple plots from acquiring more land. Exchanges that would leave one party with insufficient land to meet their basic subsistence needs and rent obligations, or any case in which a transferee had paid the debt of the transferor, as it probably meant that a local moneylender was getting hold of the land. So settlement officer Charles Bell, in his 1902 settlement report, included a detailed description of the rules and norms surrounding how marriage and kinship should affect lease transfers among Nepali, Lepcha, and Bhutia people. Bell noted that land inheritance amongst these groups was nearly exclusively patrilineal. Only when there was no near male relations did widows or daughters ever inherit. Nepali men who inherited leases from their fathers had to be prevented from turning their fathers' widows off the land, especially since, Bell claimed, Nepalis tended to marry multiple women, creating split loyalties amongst their sons. Right? These became land questions, these kinship questions. The settlement report actually goes through several group-specific perturbations as to how women could be protected in instances of their husband's death. So from 1883 to 2015, Kalimpong was part of the district of Darjeeling. For most of the colonial period, the district was afforded special legal status, whereby the laws in effect in the rest of India, or even the rest of Bengal, were not applicable to the region. The chief reason for this exception was the dominance of the plantations in the district. This gave tea planters broad latitude to create their own labor codes, but it also afforded a bespoke approach to land, tenancy, and exchange relationships in these spaces just outside of the plantations. So since the annexation of Darjeeling from Sikkim in 1835, British governors had in place a funding structure which came to be known as the Darjeeling Improvement Fund, or DI Fund. This fund was used for local improvement writ large. This included the construction of roads, sanitation works, and infrastructural development. During the first two Kalimpong settlements in 1882 and 1892, the DI Fund established and paid for the upkeep of small markets, right, these little huts, and a handful of larger bazaars, both inside and outside the bounds of the government estate, including in key choke points around the plantations. Both oral, historical, and archival accounts of DI Fund markets describe them as moving food from agricultural villages, in Kalimpong in particular, to meet the subsistence needs of the region's plantations and hill stations. In the plantation-dominated landscape of the Darjeeling district, then, there emerged a form of accumulation that depended as much on the allocation and distribution of productive responsibilities as it did upon the allocation and distribution of reproductive responsibilities, right? Such as the building and maintenance of infrastructure, the regulation of marriage and inheritance, tree planting, water distribution, and of course, feeding and eating. How this production of agricultural surplus, was achieved in Kalimpong, however, was not straightforward. Kalimpong was incredibly remote. So the disciplinary project of making live, making work, and making food required some assistance. So that leads me to part 2.
Hi, Sara.
Yes? Yes?
Yes, actually, your presentation is in the slide number 1 still. So can you
Oh,
just...
well, you should have told me. I told you that this program is not very helpful with this program doesn't work with Microsoft.
I didn't want to break the flow, so yes.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Please interrupt me always, because that's kind of terrible. You just had to listen to me talk forever about stuff that was completely irrelevant to the pictures. Okay, so let me just start again, and I'll just keep it like this because obviously it doesn't work. Let's see. All right, how do I change it? Okay, I just have to manually move it. It looks like. Okay, great. Okay, so all right, we're here. I hope this works. If it doesn't, again, please interrupt me because I have no idea what it looks like from your end, at all. So, okay. Colonial authorities found a willing collaborator, right? So again, Kalimpong's remote, colonial governance was kind of at its very frontier edges here. Colonial authorities found a willing collaborator to kind of to make proxy for their for governance in the Scottish Presbyterian mission and deputized the mission's charismatic leader, the Reverend John Graham, right? You see here is the one with the fluffier mustache, to carry out many of the functions that civil servants performed in southern Bengal. In turn, the colonial government provided support to the church in the form of money, as well as swaths of rent-free land for schools, vocational programs, and residences for white and newly converted local Christian parishioners. Reverend Graham arrived in Kalimpong from Edinburgh in 1889, a few years after the first settlement of Kalimpong and the founding of the Bengal Agricultural Department. Graham spent much of his first 10 years in the region evangelizing among plantation villages and newly settled farm plots. During the first year of his ministry, Graham worked to host an annual kind of agricultural fair known as the Mela, which brought farmers and herders to Kalimpong town for competition, sociality, and agricultural education, right? And this kind of what becomes like a very kind of important annual event in Kalimpong. So in 1900, Graham established the St. Andrew's Colonial Homes. The Homes, as it's called today, remains a widely known English medium boarding school. But the school was initially devoted to the education of Anglo-Indian children. And so here you can kind of see in this picture, I hope you can see this picture, both circled kind of in a pen. You can actually see I think you can see my cursor, right? This is the school, right? This is the homes, and then this is the demonstration farm, which I kind of talked about a little bit earlier. Graham's aim was to ensure that these children, the progeny of tea planters and civil servants, became productive citizens of the empire. Reverend Graham had seen so-called blue-eyed children in the tea plantation villages on visits to his planter friends. The existence of these children on plantations was framed in colonial accounts as a wicked problem and an intractable concern for government, one which betrayed a moral failing at the heart of the plantation enterprise. Graham's work took on the rhetoric of rescue and rehabilitation. Graham modeled his school on residential homes in the United Kingdom, which aimed at uniting orphaned children into one big family. The school was arranged into small cottages. These small cottages like you see here, right, which is, that house students, right? So this is one cottage, right, and all of the students who live in that cottage in front of it. The disciplinary figure in each of these cottages was a European mother or auntie in charge. A surrogate family headed by a desexualized European matriarch was intended not just to domesticate, but to racialize. The Homes was funded through donations, and the school advertised itself to potential donors across India and Europe as an effective solution to the Eurasian question. Graham's promotional material explained that the Homes was testing a belief that by separating the Anglo-Indian progeny of planters, from their social context and relocating them into the rigid order of European-style education and the redemptive climate of the hills, these children could be schooled into whiteness. Early issues of the St. Andrew's Colonial Homes magazine explained that the Homes is the training ground, the starting point, and yonder is the goal, far off in the distant light. That goal was the absorption of Homes graduates as possible white settler colonists elsewhere in the empire. Graham's experiment necessitated a faith in the malleability of race. So Graham's educational objective was to give Anglo-Indian children vocational and social skills so that they could pass as white outside of India. Students were resettled across the British Empire, primarily in New Zealand and Australia. Between 1908 and 1938, 130 graduates had been resettled in New Zealand alone. And what you see here is a group of students sent to New Zealand from the Homes in 1912. And historian Jane McCabe has actually done a lot of really interesting work from the New Zealand side of the story on the receiving of these students. So though the Homes offered courses in a variety of vocational subjects for both Anglo-Indian boys and girls, its most visible feature was the Homes farm, where boys trained in agricultural science and methods. Vocational training for men also included trades like blacksmithing and carpentry. For women, training involved handicraft production, including needlecraft and lace making, and service work such as nannying and nursing. Such subjects were keyed, importantly, to labor shortages in settler colonies. And here's one of the vocational training buildings, right here, the white building in the background, from 1920 at the homes. The model factories and fields of the homes intertwined faith, salvation, and productivism. Faith in the malleability of race, faith in the disciplinary notions of family, and faith in gendered manual labor and the promise of modern agriculture. Again, the interplay between social reproduction and the management of surplus population is salient here. Anglo-Indians were seen as a problematic surplus population in India, and specifically the plantation regions of North Bengal. But once whitened, they could serve the empire. Henry Edmonds, with whom I began my talk, and since you missed this picture, I'll kind of go back to it for a hot second. All the way back here, there he is, Henry Edmonds, pit helmet and all, right? And I'll now come back to where I was. Henry Edmonds, right, was one of the first students to graduate from the homes, like literally one of the first. Unlike many graduates, though, Edmonds was not resettled abroad. Within the agronomic and academic training he received at the homes, Edmonds went on to operate a farm of an English couple in southern Bengal. He then later passed the civil service examinations and secured a place within the Bengal Agricultural Department. A favorite, kind of a teacher's pet of Dr. Graham, Edmonds would not be gone from the hills for long. So while Edmonds was still a student at the homes, colonial administrators started to take a keen interest in Graham's agricultural fair, the annual Mela. The 1902 settlement report praises the Mela as a vehicle for solidifying productivity and an entrepreneurial spirit amongst the ryots. In return for government support, Graham and his fellow missionaries organized demonstrations and presentations on cattle husbandry, fertilization, and agricultural implements. If the DI Fund's network of huts functioned in part as a means of using peasant agriculture to replenish the plantation, supplying its labor force with the foodstuffs it lacked, then the establishment of the homes functioned, at least in part, as a means of absorbing the plantation's moral excesses. At the homes farm, the annual Mela, visitors could witness firsthand the redemption of Anglo-Indian men, whose whitening was symbolically evidenced by the plenitude of their harvests and the ingenuity, the modernity of their methods. While the moral contrast between Kalimpong and the homes in particular, and the surrounding plantations was personified most clearly in the successful, independent Anglo-Indian male farmer, the Mela also collapsed these redemptive and productivist projects in the figure of the Kalimpong riot, who came to experiment with new agricultural methods and came to be experimented on too, and that's kind of key. They themselves became a laboratory for various kinds of forms of social work. Farming competitions and missionization evidence that Nepalis, Bhutias, and Lepchas could also live productive and virtuous lives here on the margins of the plantation, though everyone had their place. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to move on to part 3, and I just kind of hope that all of this is still working. So part 3, right, thinking about agricultural demonstrations specifically. So by 1902, and the kind of third and most extensive settlement of Kalimpong, not only was the Mela, that agricultural fair, a regional event, right, but also, right, the homes farm, right, surrounding the school's cottages was producing enough vegetables, meat, and dairy to source the needs of Graham's growing boarding school. So, right, so all around, kind of essentially where this black pen line is, are farms that are sourcing food for the school as well. And then in addition, there's this satellite farm, and essentially the fields are running from the bazaar, which is right about here, all the way down, right, way off your screen, down to the Reli River. So with the financial backing of the Agricultural Department in 1907, Graham opened the first and only demonstration farm located outside of the Bengal Plains, which right? And the agricultural department provided the homes with a large grant to fund the farm for 5 years, initially 5 years only. The proviso that while Graham would appoint and oversee all farm staff, the demonstration work would be dictated by the agricultural department. So as you can kind of see here, this is a map, right? I'm going to zoom in a second. The kind of proliferation, all the colored dots, right? Just like the saturation of colored dots are all of the different forms of agricultural experimentation sites and demonstration farms in Bengal in the early 1900s, right? So saturation of dots is what I want you to get from here. And now zooming in, you can kind of see that Kalimpong is the only, right, demonstration farm in the hills, right? The orange triangle. The blue circle is actually a silviculture farm in Karshong that fails. But that's beside the point. So while other scholars have written about the Homes resettlement projects, right, namely J. McCabe, Graham's efforts to use agricultural education and experimentation to improve the lives of Nepali Lepcha and Bhutia riots who lived in Kalimpong is much less well known, right? And that's kind of what I want to do with this project. So too is the intertwined work of the homes, the church, and agricultural and land bureaucracies in Bengal, right, in Kalimpong, which was and continues to be distributed across the town and villages of the entire region, not just abroad. It was in Kalimpong and on the demonstration farm that the educational mission of the colonial bureaucracy and the Protestant mission quite literally converged. Christian redemption coincided with the redemption of Anglo-Indian men through work with and experimentation on Kalimpong's crops and their farmers. So the heart of the farm was the demonstration ground, which you see here in this picture, hopefully, where riots could come to collect seeds, either at no cost or highly subsidized, and learn how to plant and care for them. So again, you've seen this picture, but I'll just put it back up again, right? That's what was circled is the demonstration ground. The government funded the project with the primary objective of propagating English fruit trees, including apricots, plums, and walnuts grown from seedlings from the royal nurseries of Maidstone, England. Yes, these fruits were to be sold to European occupants of Darjeeling, right? Namely, that seasonal colonial infrastructure. The harvesting and season for many of these English fruits corresponded with the time of year that colonial administration shifted to the hills. But over the first 5 years, these experiments in fruit largely failed. So the farm was more successful, at least in the short term, in working on the performance of staple grain crops. The primary market for which was not the European elite, but the growing population of Nepalis as well as Bhutias and Nepalis off the plantation. Buckwheat, corn, and millet, along with lentils and soybeans, were grown on terraced and unterraced, irrigated and unirrigated plots, in some 90 different experimental plots at different altitudes. You can kind of see that here. A key question for the officers in Kalimpong was how to deal with the rapidity with which rain drains off the slopes. The agricultural department had already dedicated nearly 2 decades of research into Jaunpur maize, the Jaunpur variety of maize, which had proven to be particularly high yielding elsewhere in Bengal. But in Kalimpong, the first round of experience with Jaunpur largely failed. Local maize varieties fared much better in comparison, right? And this was a big shocker to the colonial scientists. Experimentation in these early years thus shifted from fruit to maize, and then kind of elaboration of techniques for growing crops on maize and on staple crops, not commodity crops, became the self-declared first success of the experimental farm here in Kalimpong. Right, and what the farm also does at this time too is think about, right, what kind of configuration of crops could farmers grow to get the highest amount per acre, and therefore justifying the highest rent per acre that the colonial government could charge farmers in rent, right? So there's a kind of clearly economic logic to demonstration as well at this time. Okay, so in 1914, here we go, the Homes hired Henry Edmonds back to manage the demonstration farm, which is, in 7 short years is quite successful. Edmonds enacted several changes, and here you can see Edmonds again in his kind of classic pit helmet right in the center of the farm staff. He expands rapidly experimentation beyond grains to fruits and vegetables. He also, according to those that remembered him, was central to the training of would-be resettled laborers here on the farm. He explained in a written report that the objective with taking up vegetable cultivation on the farm is to introduce amongst the ryots in the government estate and put them into the way of exporting their produce to Calcutta at suitable times, as well as provide for the needs of the new hill station of Kalimpong. All of the vegetables grown were deemed to be successful. The farm then distributed or sold at concessionary prices these seedlings of so-called foreign vegetables. And despite English fruit trees failing in years earlier, under Edmonds' tenure and through the DI fund financial support, there was a kind of success with fruit crop experiment located in a little 6-acre plot in the center of the farm. But instead of kind of apricots and plums, what was successful here were oranges and pineapples, and they became quite prolific. And Kalimpong came to export, not really export, move oranges and pineapples in particular to markets in Calcutta. And the oranges, until very recent blights in Darjeeling, had probably right about this time, been quite prolific in your own markets in Calcutta right now at this time of year. Vegetables were often described on the farm as either foreign or European or kind of local. Staple grains, on the other hand, were only designated for native population consumption. Foreign and local foodstuffs alike circulated through the network of DI-funded markets. Edmonds also expanded his demonstration work. Under his leadership, farmers were joined by local school groups from across Kalimpong in live demonstrations. School children came to the farm and took home seeds with the hope of distributing to their families, their parents, and their neighbors. The children were encouraged to explain the use of these new seeds, these new cultivation methods, and the new markets for these plants, particularly foreign vegetables. The 1920s also saw poultry experiments, kind of crossbreeding Siamese and English chickens, which many people often ask me about as I give these talks, especially in the hills. So Edmonds, here he is again, maintained that maize could remain the cornerstone of the agrarian economy in Kalimpong. He was a huge advocate for maize. And here again, and here he is right behind a whole field of maize. Edmonds even earned the moniker Makai Sab on the farm. And that's kind of how he is known, right? It was only in terms of when I began asking questions about Makai Sab and not Henry Edmonds, do people know who I was actually talking about. In the 1924 annual report of the Kalimpong demonstration farm, Edmonds wrote that when intercropped with millet, maize was how most farmers in the region could make a living and pay their rents. Edmonds oversaw the distribution of tens of thousands of pounds of seed each year. In 1928, the Bengal Agricultural Department kind of retook the farm and subleased the entirety of the demonstration farm from the homes. But Edmonds stayed on as the manager and then soon became the superintendent of agriculture for the entirety of Bengal. And he expands at this time, demonstration work across Kalimpong, and he appoints two men from the region, one Lepcha man and one Limbu man, who he appoints to kind of travel with him across the district, kind of doing in situ agricultural experiments with all of these different crops and techniques. And he has kind of 4 experimental villages that I'm also kind of working with. Edmonds in some of his final reports kind of talks about the success of his experiments with because he notices the kind of proliferation and the growth of bucka houses in these remote villages in Kalimpong, and takes the existence and the building of bucka houses as a success of his work. Okay, so to wrap things up, let me just move this down. Right here's some kind of a picture of some of the experimental, the people that were enrolled in the experimental farm. So to wrap things up, the Kalimpong demonstration farm and the work of figures like Henry Edmonds transformed life in Kalimpong. You could see maize across the landscape. and all of that is by virtue of Edmonds. And it remains a food of the villages, a food of subsistence. Seed farm managers are still referred to as Makai Babu or Makai Baji. This work also brought the annexed lands of the Bhutan doors under settled agriculture and imperial governance and made people legible. Agricultural experimentation fed the region's plantations and hill stations. What was being demonstrated, what was being extended, distributed, and reproduced through agricultural extension and experimentation was, I argue in this project, settlement itself. So today, right, here's this very building structure, here it is today. The remains of the seed farm, as it's known, are still visible across from the road from the Government of India's agricultural extension facility. The farm is not the only enduring influence of colonial logics of settlement in Kalimpong, though. Much of the land on which farmers live and work is still leased from the government, which calculates rents based on projections about the market value of maize, millet, fruit, and vegetables. Attention to the plantation's outsides has some implications for ongoing discussions in my own discipline of anthropology and perhaps kind of interdisciplinary conversations beyond. We've seen the plantation extended to describe a huge swath of industrial formations. But I want to ask, how might an attention to post-colonial theory and bringing our attention to kind of hybridity and contradictions of productivist projects kind of at any scale kind of shape and refine our understanding of the plantation? The case of Kalimpong is illustrative of the way in which small-scale, more seemingly biodiverse modes of agriculture production were and continue to be adjunct adjacent or even adjunct in Sylvia Winter's terms to the growth and persistence of the plantation. But the historical contemporary relationship between these spaces, the plantation and its outsides, are not so much about ruination, but about relationality. These relationships highlight the ongoing temporal dissonant and unequal reproductive work of settlement. Reproduction is not a mere metaphor. The making of kin, the maintenance of infrastructure, and the circulation of seeds highlight how the processes of making land productive, of making it settled, of making it a thinkable and workable economic and ecological space are reproductive ones. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. There's a contemporary picture of the seed farm. Thanks so much for your time and dealing with the technological issues. I'm done. I don't know how you want to like fix the share.
Thank you, Professor. It's an amazing lecture. Really listening to him, you recognize you have stopped, and it was really amazing. Can you hear me, Professor?
Yep, I can hear you fine. Yep, totally.
Yes, it was really nice. It was really nice, and it's such a. I mean, I don't have heard of this kind of work being done on Kalimpong much. So this is a very new area of research.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea too, is like, right, the T and Syncona are kind of these hegemonic forces in forms of, in ways we represent the hills. So how do we kind of think orthogonally to those crops? Not that they're not important, but like thinking, again, that it's orthogonal, not fully alternative.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And we have some questions in YouTube.
Okay.
Can you go it?
Yeah, no, totally. That's great. I don't see the questions, so you'll have to.
Okay. Yeah, I'll show them to you. You can see on the
screen.
Okay. Yeah. So Udaju Pramanik is asking, a number of European missionaries, their Indian converts, people seeking job as coolies, servants, and scavengers all contributed to the clearing of jungles and extension of the human habitat. And with passing ahead, the new settlers mingled with the local people and contributed to the growth of an immixed cultural characteristic feature of the society. How did the superimposition of religious beliefs have an impact on the economic consequences? I believe he's speaking about that Kalimpong only. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question and really kind of part of the whole question that animates the entire project, right? So there's not like a neat, easy answer to your question, right? My kind of answer to your question is like it's tentacular. It's in like many different things, right? So for me, the kind of way that I'm approaching it is through the idea of productivism, right? So to me, the kind of the key concept in kind of thinking about the relationship between the economic and the religious is that of productivity, right? So how is productivity used as a means of both making money for the colonial government and reforming and making legible, civilizing, right? All of these colonial logics, right? For bringing local indigenous groups into kind of colonial, like into forms of colonial land governance, legibility, right? And so kind of ideas about productivity and rent. And so that's kind of the lens looking I'm doing to kind of answer what is, a huge and gigantic kind of question, right? That you're asking about the religious and the economic, right? Because they're not separate spheres, right? They're not at all kind of separate spheres at all, right? And so from its from its kind of colonial inception as an agricultural enclave, the religious and the economic, right, the history of Kalimpong shows were never disentangled, right? They were always kind of brought together by virtue of the fact that the Bengal government in particular deputized Graham and the Scottish mission to run essentially on the ground its kind of settlement work. And so I could answer this question for like 7 hours, but like that's the kind of, to me, what you're asking is kind of is really quite interesting because it's not just about conversion, right? Or like religious, the presence of Christian missionaries here is not just about conversion at all. It's about it's about shaping how the very notions of land, settlement, rent, belonging, productivity, reproductivity, it shapes all of those ideas. And so like amazing question.
Thank you so much, Professor. We don't have any more questions in YouTube, but I think participants can email you if they want. Your email address was given, and we'll
Yeah, I guess
send
you
you.
saw it for a really long time because you didn't see anything else.
Yeah, yes. So if you just play the lecture again, I think you can see that for a long time.
I
And
hope so. Maybe don't.
also, I think Pratim had to ask some. He had some questions. Pratim, are you here? Can you hear us? Pratim, are you here?
He went to go get a snack. As I understand, it's all very late for you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
He's here. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Pratim. Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry for the noise. Actually, I want to ask you, Professor. Since this is like a really new area, and I don't have much to say or contribute, but I think how you are thinking of like sort of collecting. Uh, I mean, uh, their narratives. Or have you ever collected their oral narratives or something, or how like they are going to assess the condition of these settlers? I mean, what methodology actually would you thinking of to take since you are like working on this project and this is going to be the project for your fellowship also, if I am not wrong. So how you are thinking to like sort of ask these questions or to sort of find out that how they are like in the current state or how they are like is there any option to rehabilitate them or anything? So this is like the small question or like some small kind my from my particular like or more than curiosity to ask you actually.
No, it's not a small question. I mean, it's a huge question. Like, and part of what I want to do methodologically with this. So yes, what I've presented today is mostly based on my work on colonial archives, right? And for as many of us are all in the position right now of not being able to do extended, in-person field work, right? That's kind of what I've been kind of talking about. But what I want to do, a couple things methodologically. First is take these documents, right, the settlement reports, excerpts of the settlement reports, some of the material that the Church of Scotland writes about Kalimpong, and actually make that the grounds for my interviews and with folks in Kalimpong when I can go back, ideally starting in the summer, right? And as you mentioned, for the whole of the fellowship project, right? So key methodology one is actually to kind of do more deliberate historical ethnographic work. So like myself and many of us, right, my past work kind of did archival research and did ethnographic research, and they come together in the writing, right? They come together in the writing of my books, right? But here, what I want to do methodologically is take the archival documents, take the historical, and make that the grounds through which I kind of do my ethnographic work. Does that make sense, right? So I kind of have focus groups and have like translated or just, excerpted parts of the settlement reports in particular about Kalimpong or the colonial land documents, and kind of have that as a space of conversation and critique and kind of thinking about like, what people in Kalimpong, namely folks that live on the seed farm, in the contemporary seed farm or adjacent to the seed farm, or in some of these agricultural villages within Kalimpong, right? So I have different kind of groups of people that I'm working with, kind of to ask them what they think about these documents, right? And to kind of, right, when you read this, what do you think about? Like, what is it like? Tell me about what's here. And then secondly, right, so that's kind of part one. Part two is, yes, exactly, to do more longer form oral histories with people in Kalimpong about their plots of land, about what they farmed, about how they came to have this land, about land rights, about rents, about kind of their narrativizing the plot and narrativizing belonging vis-a-vis land and production. Like, why do you farm what you farm? And like kind of really like taking banal questions like that and kind of making them historical questions, but making them oral historical questions, and allowing for a very open, iterative interview structure, or really oral history structure, whereby I kind of tell the story of an environmental history of land through the long form narratives of folks in Kalimpong, right? Both on the seed farm and outside of the seed farm. And then, ideally too, having people who worked on the seed farm not too long ago kind of, lead me through kind of plot walks on the seed farm, right? And we're looking at the old, infrastructure of experimentation, and kind of pairing that emic kind of, right, Kalimpong-centric narrative of what agricultural extension was and is, and kind of juxtaposing that with kind of the dominant frame from the scientists who are still working on the seed farm in the government kind of agricultural extension agents, right? And kind of like juxtaposing those two narratives about production, about land, about making Kalimpong an agricultural landscape. So those are just like three kind of like cuts on how I'm doing the ethnographic piece, which again, so I'll be there this summer, and then in December I'll be starting a year of research in Kalimpong, and again in some places sometimes in Calcutta, but primarily in Kalimpong, to kind of do the whole ethnographic piece. So the historical piece is mostly, at least the stuff that's available through the kind of British available colonial archives, is finished. Great question, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And Professor,
Thank you,
I
Professor.
believe, yeah, like in one of your book, I read about, like, you wrote about how gardens are. I mean, like, especially tea gardens, how they're a way of disciplining labor. And so, what about in Kalimpong? I mean, like, from your own, your own fieldwork experience, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so my kind of like play here is, how is it not just the plantation that's this ordering logic, this disciplining logic, but how are non-plantation spaces, right, that are like, I mean, this is a non-plantation space that is very much contrived by colonial like notions of extraction and production, right? So like, how is this non-plantation space? So like, before I started this project, I talked about the plantation is this disciplining logic, the way it, like, but like, it's more like the colonial government's vis-a-vis agriculture is way more than that, right? And so it's by kind of thinking about the relationality between the plantation and the off-plantation, right? You see the kind of continuities of plantation logics onto non-plantation spaces, and vice versa, right? Like, what are the ways, what are the reproductive logics of the plantation through food, right? And like one of the relationships that I want to kind of think with here is how, by virtue of there being a plantation economy, whereby most people cannot make enough of their own food to subsist on, right? It necessitates this non-plantation landscape to, provide food for markets for plantation workers to kind of just make, to subsist, right? To just have enough grain, especially grain crops, to be able to keep the plantations, to move it forward. You're absolutely right. Thank you for that provocation. That's kind of what I want to kind of think with, is just that, like, how is settlement itself as a really broad logic, or right? It's not epiphenomenal, right? That this Kalimpong is called a government estate, and there's like hundreds of government estates in Bengal at this time, right? This is not just like some weird random one-off thing, right? There's across Bengal, this is a kind of question to non-plantation, or this is a colonial kind of answer to not like how to make agricultural enclaves, right? And there's the government estate is a form that's been really not thought about, especially in kind of the histories of Bengal. And like, maybe it hasn't been thought of because it's not that interesting, but I think it's really interesting, right? As like, what is this thing called an estate, right? We often call plantations estates, but this is like, what are the estate logic, right? What are the continuities between the plantation and the non-plantation, right? Through disciplining of environments and people. So yeah, awesome question.
Thank you, Professor. And also, like in Kalimpong, it's a mixture of Nepali people, Lepcha people, Bhutia people. So, it's obviously they use the Nepali as the common denominator. I mean, it's the common language for communication. So, like in the colonial period, so you have worked on archival data as well, and you have also, I think, interviewed people there over there, the workers, the tea garden workers. So, like, what was their experience? Not just their, I mean, their ancestors' experience, and how does about this language situation, and how does it differ from the archival data? I mean, is there any difference you found?
Well, I mean, I guess I don't so much about difference as like I wanted to kind of know how these very regimented,
language politics.
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Yeah. So like what about like, so I mean, so like for me it would be about like idioms as opposed to like language. So like, what are the idioms of land? What are the idioms of inheritance and property, and how do they kind of shape everyday life, right? So like one of the ways in which I'm kind of looking at that is around marriage and inheritance and kinship questions, right? So much energy of the settlement officer in a place like Kalimpong was put into managing how women could, live without their, if in the case of their husband, dying, or how property could or could not transfer across groups. And I want to actually, like, part of what I'm doing with folks, like when I'm doing the ethnographic research in the Bali, right? Like, again, thinking about the language, is to think about how they narrate and how folks narrate those questions of inheritance in particular, right? The history of a plot, right? To kind of put it in very mundane terms, right? And that's kind of back to kind of Pratim's question about like how to kind of construct an open-ended narrative, or kind of about the environmental history of Kalimpong through the idea of these land plots, through the idea of settlement, that is not, right? So how does settlement emerge? Or what does settlement mean in not just in the Pali, but in the idioms of land and inheritance and kinship and making place and growing things? Like, how does settlement make sense in that idiom versus how does it make sense in in this kind of super kind of top down hegemonic, like settlement needs to work the same everywhere colonial logic? Right, so settlement to me is that concept that I'm kind of playing with within and across languages. So like, what does settlement mean here? What does settlement mean here? Or when we're talking about settlement, this is why I love anthropology. When we're talking about settlement, like broadly, what are people talking about when they talk about settlement? That to me is the language question Does that make sense? Is that because that kind of jive with what you're like? What do people talk about when they talk about settlement? That's my. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And also, like Kalimpong has also, I think, been the place. I mean, if I'm not wrong, some prince or princess from Afghanistan was there, and some elite people were there, and all the last king of Myanmar's descendants were there. So I think it's a very different kind of society there, with plantation, non-plantation, the elite
Yeah.
class, and so on.
Oh yeah, there was a bunch of. I mean, like the 1950s in Kalimpong was like just a kind of pantheon of just fabulously elite, interesting people, right? Yeah, the
Yeah,
deposed king of Burma, and what else? Like, yeah, princes of Afghanistan. What else? Prince Peter of Greece was an anthropologist that was like kind of
I forgot his
measuring
name.
people's
Yeah,
heads, measuring Tibetan refugees' heads. Yes, what is it? Rabindranath Tagore's son,
yeah,
right,
Tagore
who
son.
painted all
Yeah,
of these
yeah.
landscapes. Anyway, so like I could kind of go on, right? It becomes this kind of like and that's kind of one of the things that I find interesting about Kalimpong. It becomes an experiment in multiple ways, right? And it's an experiment for like Western Tibetologists to be able to study Tibet, especially in the 1950s after the Chinese occupation of Tibet. It's an experiment on colonial notions of productivity, and it becomes this kind of place apart in many ways, this outside, right? It's a place that's safe for deposed kings and whatnot.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. And Pratim and Purbasha, if you have any question, because I'm constantly talking and talking, asking. Purbasha, Pratim, do you have any questions?
No, Hartika, I don't have any.
Okay.
I
But
don't have any
because I've,
question.
yeah,
Thank you, Mom, for coming to our forum. Thank you.
yes, it's been a lovely evening today for us, and it's been a lovely lecture as well. And we look forward to this work. I hope it will be published in a book soon.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. I mean, just pandemic permitting, I can
Yeah,
kind of finish the research. Let's all, and I hope the same for all of you. That you and I want to that
yeah.
you all can get back to the things you really want to do and the people you're accountable to. So yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, this was a total pleasure. Thank you for
Would
the invitation.
like to meet you when you come here in India.
Totally. Let's keep in touch.
Yes, let's keep in touch. And thank you so much, ma'am. And Pratim, if you can hear me,
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
yeah. Okay, can you please deliver the formal vote of thanks for Professor Beske? Just some
Yes,
formalities we do.
actually. Uh, yes, sorry, actually, I have bit travel with the camera thing. So anyway, thank you. A big thank you to Professor Sara Beske for joining us today. And it was like really nice to hear from her the entire thing and the entire project he will be working on is this like forthcoming year. And also like very welcome to Kolkata whenever she visit here, and I would really love to converse with him. I mean beyond this like virtual boundary and everything. So anyway, I don't take much time, but it's like a pretty noisy. But anyway, a big thank you to everyone and the participants who are like with us today.
Yeah.
I will see you in the next session of CC19. So thank you everyone and thank you. Good night and good morning probably to Professor Saraviki. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor,
Thank you
so
very
much for
much.
joining us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, all right. Thank you all. All right, I'm going to hit my red button.
Yes.
See you in 3D hopefully soon. All right, bye-bye.
Bye bye.